Hello, natural resource friends, and welcome back to the Back Porch and to another session of Back Porch Forestry. I'm Dr. David Merker, Extension Forester with the University of Tennessee. For those of you that might be new to the Back Porch Forestry are a series of non-formal educational sessions that address a variety of topics that kind of center on the topics of trees and forest management. I like to say that they are 30-30s, roughly 30 slides in no more than 30 minutes. Today's topic is unique in that we will be discussing livestock grazing in woodlands, specifically some of the benefits, what are the detriments, and then some brief management recommendations that might help those out that do have livestock in the woods. So bear with me as I share my screen and we'll get started today. Back Porch Forestry. Today's presentation is a summary of a lengthier publication that I put together with Dr. Jason Smith. He's our former extension beef cattle specialist. So there was buy-in from both the forestry and the animal science department on this. And at the conclusion of the presentation, I will give you the URL so you can find this publication if you would like to download it. I'd like to begin with a disclaimer. First of all, I have nothing against the cattle industry at all. Both my grandfathers raised cattle, and 65% of Tennessee's land is either woodland or pasture land or both. So it's both of these industries are vital to the economy of both Tennessee and the Southeast, and indeed the nation as well. And secondly, grazing woodlands, I want you to understand, isn't inherently wrong, but there may be some consequences. And I want to try to draw out some of those consequences today. I'm kind of driven by the adage that says there's always a better way. And so hopefully we'll be able to discover some concepts that might be a better way of having cattle in the woods. And then finally, I'm not addressing the topic of silvopasture. That's something completely different, where you bring cattle and timber together intentionally for the purpose of trying to grow both of them simultaneously. So that's not what this is about today. I want to begin by addressing just a couple slides here that talk about some of the benefits of grazing, why our livestock out in the woods. And primarily it boils down to a couple things. And the first is that there's access to additional forage. So as you look at this photograph, there's a lot of green out there, and green is potential forage. But remember, in the forest, a lot of that forage is not reachable. It's beyond the reach of the cattle. And then secondly, once it's eaten up, it doesn't respond. It doesn't grow back very quickly either, because it's shaded. And so it's not like pasture land where grass grows back quickly. Now, regarding this subject, access to forests, understand that cattle and sheep and horses are grazers. They like grasses and legumes. Deer and goats are browsers. So they're opportunists. They'll eat anything, including twigs and acorns and what have you. And when we bring cattle into the woods, essentially we're forcing them to become something they're not. We're forcing them to become browsers. So keep that in mind. Remember, too, that woodland forage, as I've alluded to, is short-lived, and oftentimes it's substandard in both protein and energy. And so there might be an initial benefit to it, but in the long run, it doesn't pan out as well. Weight gain can be limited in woodlands due to the steep terrain. Understand that, the reason why it's woodland is because it probably didn't make good pasture land or good tillable land. It's hilly. And because of that, cattle spend a lot of energy climbing up and down the hills just to pick up a few sprigs of food. So their weight gain is limited, if at all, when they're in the woods. And then finally, it takes, and this is kind of a broad range, but it takes about 10 to 40 acres of woodland to equal 1 acre of improved pasture land. And so a 10 to 1 or even a 40 to 1 ratio is not very good when it comes to the health of your livestock. The other benefit revolves around simply the environment. There's less environmental stress to the livestock. That includes both protection from the hot and the cold. So as you look at the left picture, I don't know exactly what the temperature difference is between an open pasture land and a woodland, but guessing, I would say it's probably 10 degrees cooler in the heat of the summer, maybe more. I know as a forester, I prefer being in the woods than being in the pasture land. And so obviously the cattle realize that benefit too. But as you look at that particular photograph, you can see there's not much there for them to eat. So they're not there really for weight gain purposes. They're there for protection. And the same can be said during cold weather, protection from wind, maybe protection from snow. It helps, though, if there's some cedar mixed in with the pasture land, because that's going to block more wind. However, I have heard cattle men say that cattle producers also say that the cedar can cause a problem during calving season, because you can't find the calves during after they've been birthed. So that's a couple of the benefits of having livestock in the woods. We're going to turn our attention to some of the detriments, but I want to begin by talking briefly about how woodlands operate in cycles. So understand that it's more than just trees, it's more than just a forest, but lots going on out there, including water. Water is constantly cycling through precipitation and transpiration, evaporation. Carbon and nitrogen are going to cycle. Plants cycle seasonally, and as the forest develops and so forth. Wildlife is going to fluctuate in and out both seasonally, as well as the wildlife changes and matures and so forth. And then finally, even aesthetics and recreation can, in a sense, cycle through the forest. So woodland grazing, particularly when it's heavy, and I underscore the word heavy, when it's heavy, can disrupt and even negatively affect these cycles. So keep that in mind, and maybe some of the slides that follow will help you understand that. So some detriments of grazing. Again, the operative word here is excessive grazing. I've broken this into three categories, and that is impacts on forest productivity, impacts on the environment as it relates to degradation, and then impacts on the livestock through toxicity of some of the plants. So let's begin talking about some of the impacts on forest productivity. The effects on forest productivity. Soil is going to be greatly impacted, or at least potentially greatly impacted when a forest land is being pastured. And particularly soil erosion can occur on trails when the trails are concentrated, or on the stream banks. And so cattle tend to follow certain trails, and they compact the soil on these spots. But that in turn can lead to soil erosion, because water wants to funnel down these trails. And that certainly affects the productivity of the forest. I've mentioned also soil compaction. Understand that just estimating the weight of a cow might be 1,000 pounds with 4 hooves. That's 250 pounds per hoof at any given time. And as they walk, well, let's assume that the hoof has 10 square inches each hoof, just for the sake of discussion. As they walk, they're going to lift 2 of those hooves up. So it goes from 250 pounds to 500 pounds per hoof. And if there's 10 square inches on a hoof, that's 50 pounds of pressure per square inch. So that's going to lead to a lot of soil compaction. And what's the problem with soil compaction? Well, soil compaction in turn can lead to artificial drought. And I've witnessed this many times through my career, where the trees should be growing better than they are, but they're not. And it's a pastured woodlot. Compacted soil, of course, closes in the soil pores. It's the soil pores that hold water. And so as the rain, the precipitation comes, it hits the compacted soil, and it bounces off and continues down the slope. And so instead of percolating into the forest for later use by the trees, it disappears into a stream somewhere. And so that's one of the effects. As well, we can talk about destruction of tree seeds and seedlings and saplings as well, because they will feed on these things while they're in there. And then conversion to undesirable tree species. I'll show you a table here in a second, but cattle tend to feed on the more desirable tree species, the ones that are more valuable, that we prefer to grow in the forest, and tend to avoid those that are the undesirable or unacceptable growing stock species. Mineral stain, dote, and hollowing of wood. Timber buyers are well aware of the fact that heavy pasturing can have on the quality of the timber. If it doesn't cause hollowing out or dote means a soft or kind of spongy wood, it can lead to mineral stain. And mineral stain, of course, leads streaking in the wood, and who wants cabinets with black streaks in it? So typically trees like that don't go to the finer markets for hardwood. They might go to things like railroad ties and pallets where staining doesn't matter. Just some photographs showing the effects of livestock on woodlands and woodland soils. You can see soil compaction here has actually caused the roots to become exposed. Now, these are the lateral roots. From these lateral roots normally will spring forward root hairs or fine roots. And those are the roots that procure the moisture and nutrients. And they can't do that if they're above the ground. Those fine roots won't emerge. They would dry up and die. So that's going to make it difficult for the tree to absorb or procure the water nutrients that they need. In addition, of course, they're scuffing off of the root bark. You can see exposed inner roots there. And that's where the mineral stain enters in and affects the quality of lumber inside the tree. Of course, the bark can be impacted too. Cattle don't feed on bark very much, but I suppose under some conditions that they will. I know horses certainly will. And so naturally, this is going to affect the quality of the trees as they grow. And then here's that hollowing out I was talking about. Particularly, it tends to begin on young trees where they're damaged, and then as they become older, they try to grow around this, but it creates rotten spots in the tree. That may eventually seal up, but that hollow spot will always be with it. And it creates kind of a barreling effect or a bulge, kind of a swell at the base of the tree that tells foresters and timber buyers that the base of these trees are not well at all. And they actually have to, after they cut them off, they butt them off to leave portions into the wood. So the volume of wood capable of being produced in the forest is going to decline in some cases. I mentioned browsing on desirable seedlings. This is a southern red oak, which certainly is a desirable species in our region. And they feed on the terminal portions of it. Often that's where the more nutritious and more tender growth is. But they tend to avoid trees like this, red cedar. And so, as mentioned, the good species tend to disappear from the forest and are replaced by the undesirable trees. So I've got a list of livestock browsing preferences according to trees. And you'll see those that are readily browsed, the left column, under even light grazing include yellow poplar, white ash, sugar maple, red maple, northern red oak, white oak, American elm, black gum, red bud. Something I want to point out, those with an asterisk are the trees that are typically higher in value or certainly higher in demand. And those are the ones that the livestock prefer to graze on. So these species tend to, in the long run, disappear from the forest. And the trees in the right column are the ones that overtake the forest because they are rarely browsed. Hornbeam and persimmon, pawpaw, red cedar, osage orange, hawthorn, and even devil's walking stick. Most of those trees you can't even when they're mature, they don't get big enough to produce much of a log. So the value of the forest, at least its ability to produce high value trees, will diminish in time. Talk briefly about damage to the environment, another category. And largely what I'm referring to is the loss of wildlife habitat in this case. If you look at the photograph on the left, now that's obviously some heavy pasturing. But what I want to point out, and you can see it, it's devoid of not only ground vegetation, but it's devoid of organic matter that you typically see on the ground, leaves and debris and small plants like that. And so it's just kind of like a desert underneath there. And then you'll also notice too, there's a clear, distinct browse line. In other words, it stops right about the reach of livestock head. Everything from there below is eaten and above goes out. So assuming that you're interested in wild turkey and things and deer, other species, of course, most self-respecting hen turkeys are not going to venture into a forest like that picture on the left, particularly for their nest or when they're trying to rear their poults, even particularly during the first 2 weeks when they can't fly, because there's no habitat there. There's no place to nest and hide your nest and hide your poults. 80% turkey poults don't make it through the first year, and it's largely because they can't fly for the first couple of weeks, and everything seems to grab them. And so that type of force won't be beneficial for, I've just used the example turkeys, but it could be applied to deer too. If you're a lactating doe trying to nourish one or two fawns, there's not much for you to eat and no place to hide your fawn in the left picture. So something to consider. Of course, it's not just game species like deer and turkey, but other species as well. I'll touch on those shortly. But so additionally, damage to the environment, it can cause damage to aquatic habitat as well, not just terrestrial habitat. There's a lot of loss to stream bank. When cattle have access to streams, you can see exposed soil here. Now this happens to be in an open pasture, not in a woodland, but I think you get the same point. The same holds true in a woodland. And the same thing here, if cattle are given the access to creeks, particularly if they lounge in the creeks, of course, they're going to defecate and urinate, and that can lead to E. coli bacteria, which can affect aquatic life. So something to think about is the water as well. Some other ground birds that I wanted to bring up, the whippoorwill nests in the ground. These others don't necessarily nest on the ground, but they frequent the forest floor. Brown thrush and wood thrush and brown thrasher and wood thrush and eastern towhee as well. They like forest edge and a lot of ground vegetation that you find in the forest. And of course, if it's absent, they're going to frequent someplace else or just move on. There are, of course, a whole host of poisonous plants, more than we can talk about here, but I've just listed a few of them. Some include trees. Most ranchers are familiar with the effect of wild black cherry, particularly as a green branch breaks off in a storm and the livestock eat that the foliage of the wild black cherry as it's beginning to droop and dry out. It can poison them. Of course, acorns can cause poisoning, black locust and Ohio buckeye. There's a whole host of herbaceous plants as well that ranchers would be more familiar with than I'm sure I am. But these are found typically in the woods or in a woods edge. So, well, I want to close with some management recommendations. If you're going to have cattle in the woods, here are some things to think about. It's best to identify specific areas to protect. So working with a professional forester, walk your forest land and have your forester identify where your best trees are, where the best potential is, where the likelihood of good incomes through the sale of timber can come down the road, and protect those areas first if you can. Secondly, it's good to construct interior fences to protect these areas where you're trying to grow better quality timber. Construct these interior fences. And then along that same line, it's good to retain small portions of woodland for protection for weather extremes. And so have some woodland, preferably woodland that maybe has trees of poor quality anyway or undesirable species. And I'll give you an example here. Let's just say that this is a pasture land right here, and we've got both timber and open fields that are being pastured. And you see the red represents the fencing. And so there's a lot of fence to maintain here, but yet most of the value of this pasture is in the open area right here. The woodland provides some shading, but there's not much forage out there. So why not construct a fence, something like this? What you've done is you've decreased the amount of fence that has to be maintained considerably, maybe by a third or more. And it's going to be more easily maintained fence, because the fencing around here, of course, has trees constantly and limbs falling over the fence that you have to maintain, and less so here. So you've got less fence, but we have retained some portion of the woods to benefit the livestock for shading, maybe a good source or place to have a source of water as well, and protection from cold winter and so forth. So that's something to think about. And in addition, reduce grazing intensity, rotate your cattle. Our animal science specialists would understand this much better than I would, but I've heard this mentioned on several times. So that's something to think about. In addition, limit access to streams, even if it means developing an artificial source of water as opposed to the streams, which is something that's fairly easy to maintain. And that, as well as the other practices that I've talked about, oftentimes they're eligible for cost share assistance from both the federal and state governments. So they recognize the need to protect our woodland, to protect water bodies. And so they provide cost share as an incentive to build fences and to put in artificial water treatments and other things that might be beneficial to a livestock operation. Well, that concludes this session. Please take the time, if you wish to fill out the survey. The survey is located on the YouTube site, or you can just type this in. In addition, I mentioned that we do have a publication that goes into greater detail to what I've covered today, Grazing Livestock in Woodlands. And you can find that on the YouTube site, or you can just Google my last name and that title, Grazing Livestock in Woodlands, and you will find it that way as well. So thanks for your time. I've enjoyed it. And we'll catch you again on the back porch soon.